And a top of the morning to y'all here on St. Patrick's Day, Tuesday, March 17th. A little river dance action. For those of you not familiar with river dance, a great touring show of Irish step dancing. I remember seeing that in Radio City as a kid when it first came out, and it was a big deal at the time. So a little Irish music for Song of the Day, and certainly a closing song as well. But as we return here for our second remote lesson of the week, hopefully the conferencing went well. I'm pre-recording this prior to our conferencing, so I'm hoping everything went well. And again, as always, if you guys need anything, constantly feel free to email me for any questions that you may have. But nonetheless, let's get into a quick recap and then get into our lesson today on Hamilton's financial plan. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so yesterday we left off talking about Washington and the precedents that he was going to set as the first president of the United States. And one of the most important things that Washington did and winds up setting an example for future presidents is this idea of appointing advisors. And we said yesterday in the Constitution, it doesn't specifically say that a president has to appoint advisors, but Washington realizes the importance of his position. He recognizes all the facets that the executive branch was kind of in charge of, so he wanted to appoint not just random advisors, but advisors who were considered to be the best of the best. When you think about this, some historians would argue the likes of Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph at this time, this is like the dream team. This is an all-star team, okay? And you think about John Adams as a vice president. I mean, he has top minds helping to advise him in certain areas, okay? Treasury Department, okay? That's the main focus of today's lesson, dealing with the economy. The State Department. I don't want you guys to be confused. State means Secretary of State, or the State Department means with dealing with foreign affairs, not necessarily things within the states. I think sometimes I had gotten an email, Secretary of State, does it have to do with the states? No, it has to do with, again, foreign affairs, foreign relations. Okay, so the State Department deals with foreign affairs, and then the War Department deals with setting up and organizing an army. Obviously, that's Washington's forte, but he recognizes that he can't just be a general President Washington. He needs to be the executive President Washington and overlooking these three branches. Okay, today we have 15 cabinet positions, so to speak. If President Trump in 2016, when elected, said, I don't want any advisors, technically he is not going against the Constitution, okay? But traditionally, every president has done that. We have added, or rather, Washington did add to his list with the Attorney General. Okay, attorney is a lawyer. Okay, so Randolph's job is to look at the Constitution and advise the president what he can and couldn't do within the confines of the Article 2, Section 2 powers given to the executive. So today we call this the presidential cabinet. Okay, and today we're going to take a look at what Alexander Hamilton thought of the state of the economy. Now, obviously, for President Washington's presidency, there are a number of issues that are going on in the United States. You have the fact, does the Constitution work? Does it give too much power to the federal government or not? Will the three branches of government work? Will people abide by the Constitution? Washington himself, he has nobody to lean on as far as people who have served in this position before. So when you take those issues out of the equation, I think the biggest issue facing the United States is certainly the economy, okay? And remember, as I've told you guys since September, when in doubt in history class, it's all about the money. And think about what has happened since the time of the American Revolution. Hooray for independence, but the reality was the United States entered into an economic depression. Unemployment was high. Inflation, we don't have a common currency. And for President Washington, I think dealing with the financial crisis head on is something that is going to be one of his biggest challenges during the time of his presidency. And when he appoints Alexander Hamilton and to assume this position as the Secretary of the Treasury, he's giving full confidence to Hamilton, okay, that he is going to help devise a plan and help to stabilize the economy. After all, Washington doesn't know all that much about how to fix the economy. Think about, he could probably give some advice to Henry Knox as far as forming a national army. He could probably give some advice even to Thomas Jefferson as far as being diplomatic and being a presence to represent the United States. But from a treasury or an economic standpoint, he's really putting full faith in his good friend Alexander Hamilton. And one of the big things to realize, guys, is that the United States was probably over $100 million in debt during this time period after the ratification of the Constitution and by the time Washington becomes president. That number, which is probably into the billions as far as money today, is not only debt that we have accumulated domestically. Now, domestically, what do I mean by that? I mean within the federal government, okay, going back to how we paid for the American Revolution, but also the state governments. Okay, so all the individual states have a lot of debt as well. Now, on top of that, we owe money to countries abroad. Okay, countries like France, okay, who we borrowed money for and borrowed money from in Spain. Okay, so over $100 million in debt is a lot of money. And the fact that that is hanging over our heads leads to Hamilton stepping in to develop what he would call a financial program or a financial plan. So when you think about it, what is a plan? I mean, over the last few days, we are in unprecedented times here in Kellenberg, and having to teach remotely from home, I've had to kind of write out Mr. Kirk's plan. Okay, how do I want to introduce the lesson? How do I want to introduce the homework assignments? Should I shorten the homework assignments? Are we going to change things? Okay, these are all things that you kind of weigh the pros and cons, and you come up with a plan. And that's essentially what Hamilton is going to do. And what he does with his financial plan is he's going to create 3 parts to help stabilizing the economy. All right. And here on this slide, we see the first part of his plan. The first part of Hamilton's financial plan is that he wants the United States government to assume and agree to pay all federal and state debts. Okay. Now, that seems obvious. If you owe somebody money, you're going to want to pay them back, right? But by this time, a lot of people within the federal government and even at the state level started to talk about whether or not it was even worth paying back these debts. Okay, kind of like there were some people that wanted to hit a reset button. Okay, hey, listen, this is a new government. Our old government, we weren't that organized. We're really sorry, but you know what? We're just not going to pay back the debts. We're just going to start from scratch. Okay, think about this. If I came into class and I asked somebody, Mr. Kirk didn't bring lunch money in, and I tap someone in row 2, seat 4, and I say, hey, listen, I need to borrow $10 to go down and buy some chicken fingers and fries, maybe a Slurpee and an ice cream. Okay, and that person gives me the $10, and I say, hey, not a problem, I'll pay you back tomorrow. So then Tuesday rolls around, and I come in, and person in row 2, seat 4 says, Mr. Kirk, you have my $10? I'm going, man, no, you're never going to believe it. I had the money in my hand on the bus, and it flew out the window, so I don't even have lunch money for today. Can I borrow another $10? I'll pay you back $20 on Wednesday, so I can go down and enjoy some Taco Tuesday. Okay, get some tacos, get a water, and maybe 2 bags of chips to go with my nachos. And even though I didn't pay you back from Monday, you say, you know what, Mr. Kirk, you seem like a reasonable guy. You'll pay me back, but I need that $20 tomorrow. So Wednesday rolls around. I go to the person in row 2, seat 4, and I say, listen, you're never going to believe it. I had the $20, but I made a paper airplane, and I was throwing it down the hallway, and I don't know where it went. Okay, but again, I need $10 for lunch. And finally, at some point, that person's going to step in and say, Mr. Kirk, you haven't paid me back once all week. I am not giving you a single cent until you pay me back the money that you've borrowed. And up to right now, you owe me $20. Okay, that would be the smart play. Okay, and that's kind of what Hamilton's mentality is. Okay, he says the United States can't just forget debts, because who would trust the federal government? If the government's saying, hey, we're not going to pay back people, we're not going to pay back countries, what countries would want to trade with us? So he said it was important to help the reputation of the United States and the fact that the United States should honor all debts. Okay, all debts need to be paid. And for Hamilton, he's not saying this debt's going to be paid in a week. He's not saying it's going to be paid in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. This is going to be an extended period. Okay, so this is proposed to Congress as the executive advisor to the president as the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, there are some delegates from southern states that say, wait a second, hold on 1 second, okay? We don't necessarily know if this is a good plan because many southern states had already paid off their state debts. States like South Carolina, due to the influx of the demand for tobacco and cotton overseas, many states have accumulated enough wealth through taxing that they've paid back debts. And Hamilton is asking that these states that have already paid off their debts help the other states. We're in this together. And southern states say, I don't necessarily know if that is a great idea. We don't that's unfair to the people of South Carolina to have to pay people's debts from New York. Okay? And what Hamilton says is, all right, well, this is so important to the economy, I'll make you a deal. Okay? So this is a deal that is brokered over the idea of creating and paying back the national debt. Hamilton proposed this. He says, if the southern states help to pay off, the national debt, that the federal government, and this was a topic of concern and a topic of debate previously, that the federal government will look to build and construct a national capital somewhere in the South. Okay? And southern delegates are interested, and they are intrigued by that. Right now, New York City had become a centralized location. To build a brand new city in the South that would be dedicated to the federal government is something that intrigued many of these southern delegates. So the southern delegates will agree that the United States, the states included, will help pay back that debt over time. And in return, since many of the southern states had already paid back their individual state debts, a new federal capital will be built. And the person who's going to be tasked with figuring out where to build this capital is actually going to be President Washington himself, okay, in an area in between Virginia and Maryland. Okay, Washington will survey the land as he was a surveyor originally in the Virginia militia, and he decides to basically is the true architect of the actual city, and that becomes known as Washington, D.C. Okay, so prior to Hamilton, there was no such thing as Washington, D.C., prior to this whole debate in Congress. But this will become part of Hamilton's financial plan, essentially, to get the southern states to help kick back some money towards the national debt. So as far as this three-part plan goes, all right, you could say that part one of his plan is passed. It gets a check mark. Okay, part one of his financial plan is passed. Now, not all of his parts are going to be passed, as we're going to see, but for part one, it is passed. So the second part of Hamilton's financial plan is the creation of a national bank. And I'm going to dedicate an entire slide to that on the next page, just simply because it is the most controversial, but at the same time, for Hamilton, the most important thing to help stimulate the economy. But the final part of his plan was to put a high tax on imported goods. Okay, so remember we said way back in the first trimester, an import is something that comes into the United States. And while that is said, an export exits, if that makes sense. All right? So when we talk about imported goods, Hamilton wants to tax anything that comes into the United States. And I got to get used to erasing here with my stylus. All these, not as easy as Notability here in Explain Everything. Now, why introduce taxes? Because remember, we said taxes are a way for governments to make money. I want you to take this into consideration. Okay, let's say that Spain is sending in a table, all right, and that table is $20. Okay, now by putting a federal import tax at, say, for argument's 20%, let's say 10%. Okay, let's say 25%, at 25%, because it's a high import tax. So 25% of 20 is $5. Okay, so that table, okay, for the American consumer is $25. Now, this $5, Hamilton argues, will go to the federal government. Okay, that's going to go into helping to stimulate the economy. The federal government needs to make money in order to back money up that Hamilton is hoping to begin to produce a uniform currency. But unfortunately, it becomes more expensive to the average American. However, what Hamilton is saying is that, let's say Mr. Kirk makes tables as well, and he sells it for $20. Since I'm making it in the United States, I don't have to pay or add anything to my price that would make my table more expensive. So my product stays at $20. For someone importing from Spain, say Mr. Miles, that's $25. Okay, so by default, the American products are cheaper. And if you're a good consumer, you're going to want to buy the thing that is cheaper. Okay, this $5 goes to the federal government if you want to buy an imported good. Okay, so by default, American products are cheaper. Okay, that's import taxes encourage people to buy American. And it also helps the American manufacturer make some money, because if someone's making money in the United States, they're going to wind up spending money. However, the southern states say not so fast, okay? Because southern states, in many ways, they are not manufacturing goods, okay? Southern plantations dominate the economy. So to get tables in, it's either sent down from northern states or it's imported from other countries. So southern delegates say this import tax is very much unfair, okay? Because the South relies more on imported goods than the North, okay? So when Hamilton proposes this to Congress, this is part of his plan that is not passed. Okay, so the third part of his plan, it is smart in principle, okay, but the third part of his plan, this import tax, is not going to be passed. Okay, so as of right now, a scorecard if you're keeping track at home, 3-part plan. Part 1, pay back the national debt to help restore America's reputation. That is passed, okay, on the confines that the Washington, D.C. is built, a national capital in the South. Second part of his plan gets a thumbs down, high tax on imported goods. So the tiebreaker is going to come back to this creation of a national bank. And it is going to not only change the fate of the United States' economy, but it's also going to change the fate of American politics. So one would argue that the biggest part of Hamilton's financial plan is the creation of a national bank. Essentially, what Hamilton wants the United States federal government to do is to give permission to this privately owned national bank. And this bank is kind of what I want you to think about is like the federal government's piggy bank. Okay, it would be a place where the government could deposit government funds. So all taxes that were collected not just by the federal government, but also money given to them by the states, that money would go into a specific bank. So the president, it's not as though it's the president's ATM machine and he could take money out as he sees fit, but it would be an opportunity for the federal government to back up the money that's being printed and created a uniform currency for all 13 states. Now remember, during the American Revolution, Congress had a great idea. Let's make continentals, but they became valueless because it was not backed up by anything. And as of right now, we're not on the gold standard. So what Hamilton wants to do is to create this privately owned national bank. This bank would be able to print money, okay, and it would be a place for the government to deposit all revenue. Okay, so the word revenue means money earned. So again, when we talk about money earned, that's why it is necessary for governments to tax. Although we don't want to admit it, and when money gets taken out of our pockets, we're upset by this. But right now, Hamilton recognizes the importance of taxing in a small degree, but in some cases a large degree. But we need money to back up and help to stabilize the economy. Now, while this is being presented in Congress, and many people would agree that this is exactly what the United States needs to help stabilize the economy, to help back up the American dollar that's going to be printed, there are a lot of opponents to the creation of a national bank. And one of the biggest opponents to this is Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson is the Secretary of State, okay? And he has to deal with things that are going on overseas, but he is very much in tune as to what's going on in the federal government and what's going on in Congress. And Jefferson says, and he agrees with Hamilton, that this is something that the United States needs. However, we are going down a very dangerous path if we were to allow to have this national bank created. Now, some people are like, Jefferson, what do you mean by that? And he says, well, remember, Jefferson at his core was an anti-federalist. Okay, he felt as though the Constitution went way too far in giving the federal government power. And Jefferson's argument is that nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the federal government or Congress could help to create a national bank. So he felt like something like this went against the Constitution and gave the federal government way too much power. And essentially, he feels like the national bank is unconstitutional. Okay, it did not say it word for word in the Constitution. Jefferson's argument said, hey, if a power given to Congress said they can maintain an army, they can declare war, they can create a national bank, then this bank should be created today. However, he says nowhere in the Constitution does it say this. So Jefferson becomes a very, very important person who argues and caters for a strict interpretation of the Constitution. That the federal government needs to literally take a word-for-word interpretation of the Constitution. And a lot of people, especially because of who Jefferson was, supports that idea. Now, Alexander Hamilton says, he agrees that he sees Jefferson's point of view, but he doesn't agree with him. Because he says that at this particular point in time, it is important that the United States look at the Constitution as a guideline. He says no way, shape, or form in 1787 did we sit down and figure out everything that the United States was going to need to deal with and address. And he calls upon a little thing that we talked about back in Chapter 7, Article 1, Section 8, a power given to Congress, the very last paragraph, the Elastic Clause. He says that Congress has the ability to make laws that are necessary and proper. And he says, if anything, we all could agree that a national bank is necessary, and therefore, this is good. We are good to go with the creation of a national bank. So Hamilton, who was a Federalist, he supports the power of the federal government, says that we can't take a literal word-for-word interpretation of the Constitution, but we should take a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Okay, loose interpretation meaning that it might not say it specifically, but we should have a little leeway under the Elastic Clause. Okay, remember, we said the Elastic Clause. The Constitution's, it's a little stretchy. It may not say it word for word, but we should be able to have this done. Well, as it turns out, Jefferson is a huge proponent, okay, of a strict interpretation, while Hamilton is a huge proponent of a loose interpretation. And as I have here in the notes, literally, these two grow to hate each other, okay? And they grow to hate each other so much that we dedicate an entire section to this little feud in Section 2, which ultimately leads to the birth of political parties. And for Washington, this is happening within his dream team, his all-star cabinet. Okay, Jefferson and Hamilton have become two pillars of the federal government, and to see this infighting is certainly going to take its toll not just on Washington, but also allow for political factions and parties to creep in. Now, when it's put to a vote, Hamilton's argument will win out on the sole premise that Hamilton feels as though this is what's best for the country, and under the confines of the Elastic Clause, Article 1, Section 8, the National Bank was necessary and proper. So the National Bank is officially approved in 1791. Okay, the bank itself was built in Philadelphia. Okay, if you actually, Philadelphia is one of the two mints where money is printed today. I would encourage you, if you could, to look at a coin at some point. Somewhere on a quarter or a dime, there's a little initial. It'll either say P for Pennsylvania, that coin meaning it was printed in Pennsylvania, or Philadelphia, I should say, or a D that stands for Denver. Okay, two places where money is printed today. So if you have any loose change around the house, I would encourage you to take a look at that. So we're going to stop here for today. Okay, I have created a homework assignment based off of Hamilton's financial plan. A few short questions. I think this is important. Okay, keep in mind it was a 3-part plan. 2 of the 3 parts will be approved by Congress, whereas 1 will not, and we talked about that today. So take a look at your iBook. Go and rewatch this if you have any questions about this particular lesson.